All right. So have you ever just stopped to consider those moments when, you know, our inner world kind of collides with the outer world, right? Like when you're looking at a breathtaking sunset or when you make a solemn promise to a friend. Have you ever thought that maybe, just maybe, these experiences aren't just these like fleeting mental events, but actually point to something deeper, something about the structure of reality itself? That's kind of the philosophical puzzle we're going to try to unpack in this deep dive.
And what's really interesting, especially for, someone with a philosophical mind, is that a specific group of thinkers way back in the early 20th century, they called themselves the Munich and Göttingen circles of phenomenology. They were totally absorbed with rigorously exploring precisely those kinds of questions. And this wasn't just a random assortment of individuals. They actually formed a pretty vibrant intellectual community whose insights, continue to have an impact across a wide range of philosophical areas even today.
Okay, cool. So when we say circles,
Yeah.
can you give us a little picture of who are the major players in this intellectual scene?
Oh, the scene was bustling with brilliant minds. We're talking about figures like Alfred Brunswig, Theodor Conrad, Hedwig Conrad Martius, Johannes Dalbert, August Gallinger, Moritz Geiger, Roman Ingarden. You might know him from his work in aesthetics and literary theory. And then we have Alexander Fender, Adolf Reinach, Wilhelm Schopp, Max Scheler, Edith Stein, and Gerda Wolfer. That's not even everyone. What's fascinating is they were deeply rooted in the philosophical tradition, taking inspiration from thinkers like Bergson, Bolzano, Brentano, Lipps, Lotze, Marty, and Meinong, with the work of Edmund Husserl having a particularly strong influence.
So a network of sharp minds wrestling with these really fundamental philosophical questions. But for our listener, what's the takeaway? What's the value of really diving deep into their ideas?
Well, think about it. Engaging with the core ideas of these circles offers us a fresh and often overlooked perspective on some of the most persistent philosophical questions that have been debated for centuries. They're incredibly detailed theories about consciousness, about the structure of the world, about the nuances of how we interact with each other. They can shed new light and maybe even help illuminate certain aspects of philosophical debates that you might already be familiar with.
And to make sure that our exploration is well-grounded, what kind of source material are we basing this deep dive on?
Today's journey is anchored in a fantastic piece from the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy. It's the entry on the phenomenology of the Munich and Göttingen circles. It's really thorough, rigorously researched, and it provides a really solid foundation for understanding their contributions.
So let's get this straight. Our mission, if you choose to accept it, is to delve into some of the most crucial contributions of these early phenomenologists, especially the ideas that would resonate with, a philosophical mind. So that means we'll be looking at things like their accounts of intentionality, their understanding of what objects and states of affairs really are, and their explorations of social phenomena. So where do we even begin with this influential group?
Well, if you're interested in how 20th century philosophy unfolded, a crucial starting point is this really intense debate in the early 1900s. It was all about the relationship between philosophy and psychology, and there was this huge tension, this back and forth about whether psychology was just a part of philosophy or if philosophy actually needed to be grounded in psychological principles.
I can see how that debate would have some pretty significant consequences for how we even think about philosophy. What were the main sticking points in that debate?
It really boiled down to the nature of these fundamental concepts, ethical concepts, metaphysical concepts, logical concepts. And the big question was whether these concepts were ultimately psychological at their core. Just imagine if ethical concepts could be reduced to, how our minds work, then suddenly the laws of ethics would just become psychological laws, and their study would shift from, philosophy to empirical psychology.
I see what you mean.
Yeah.
Can you give us a concrete example of this type of thinking?
Sure, take logical psychologism. This view asserted that even something as foundational as the law of the excluded middle, that idea that any proposition has to be either true or false, it claimed that this wasn't some logical necessity based in the structure of reality, but instead just a reflection of our mind's limitations, that it's psychologically impossible to simultaneously believe both P and not P. It's like saying the structure of logic is all in our heads.
Okay, but I'm guessing not everyone was comfortable with reducing all these core philosophical concepts to psychology.
You're absolutely right. While those who opposed this psychologism might have disagreed on what these concepts really meant, they were united in rejecting the notion that these concepts, logical, ethical, or metaphysical, were dependent on or could be reduced to just psychological facts.
This brings us to Theodor Lipps and the Munich Society for Psychology. How do they approach this debate?
Lipps was a really fascinating guy, stood right at the crossroads of both philosophy and psychology. He was trained as a philosopher, but was deeply involved in the emerging field of psychology. He actually held a pretty important position in the philosophy department at the University of Munich. And around 1895, he started the Academic Society for Psychology. Initially, it seemed like he was leaning towards a descriptive kind of psychologism.
So what exactly does this descriptive psychological approach mean?
Well, Lipps advocated using what he called inner perception as the main tool for describing, comparing, and organizing all the stuff that's going on in our consciousness, everything we're directly aware of. He believed that with careful introspection, we could get this direct, unshakable knowledge of our mental states and how they're structured.
And what kind of topics were they talking about in these early meetings of the society?
They covered a wide range of topics, from sensations and consciousness to feelings and drives, even discussing the very definition of psychology itself. Besides Lipps, some of the key figures in those early days were Fender, Ettlinger, and Daubert. Later on, prominent figures like Scheller also joined the discussions.
Okay, so a big focus on the inner workings of the mind. But then Husserl's logical investigations came along and things started to shift, right?
Yes, it was around 1902 when Johannes Daubert brought Husserl's logical investigations to the Munich group's attention. This was Husserl's attempt to kind of bring together the strong logical realism championed by folks like Bolzano and Frege with the descriptive psychology of Brentano and Stumpf.
And what specifically resonated with the Munich group was Husserl's strong opposition to psychologism, right?
You got it. In the first volume, The Prolegomena to Pure Logic, Husserl presented a very systematic, powerful critique of psychologism. He was arguing that the laws of logic, the basic principles of ontology, they weren't rooted in or dependent on psychological processes. He emphasized that our mental acts, while directed at objects, and that's what we call intentionality, they're actually directed at objects and states of affairs that exist and have a structure independently of our minds.
So basically saying that there's a world out there that doesn't depend on how we think about it.
Exactly. They found that incredibly compelling. These early phenomenologists in Munich saw in Husserl's anti-psychologism a real foundation for a more objectivist approach to philosophy. They really embraced the idea that disciplines like ontology, logic, ethics, aesthetics, they're all dealing with things that have their own existence, not just subjective projections from our minds. What's interesting is that while they loved Husserl's arguments against psychologism, they were more critical of his detailed theory of intentionality presented in the second volume. Some thought it almost went back to psychologism.
So it was a time of intense intellectual activity and debate. And this actually led some from Munich to go directly to Husserl in Göttingen.
You're right. In 1905, both Daubert and Reinach started attending Husserl's lectures in Göttingen, marking what some call the Munich invasion of Göttingen. Over the next few years, more of Lipps' students, guys like Geiger, Schwenninger, Conrad, and von Hildebrand, they all headed to Göttingen to study with Husserl. Göttingen was becoming a hub for the phenomenological movement.
Did this new group in Göttingen formalize their interactions? Like, did they form a society or anything?
They did. In 1907, Theodor Conrad and Paul von Seibel, they founded the Philosophical Society of Göttingen. But the real star of the show in Göttingen was Adolf Reinach. He was revered not just for his philosophical insights, but also for his incredible teaching skills. Some in the Göttingen group even saw Reinach as their main phenomenology mentor, eclipsing Husserl himself.
The period leading up to World War I sounds like it was really fertile for this budding phenomenological movement.
Oh, it was. Really productive time. They were writing and defending their dissertations, advancing phenomenological thought. In 1911, they published the Theodor Lipps Festschrift, a collection of essays by a lot of these thinkers. And then in 1913, the first volume of the Yearbook for Philosophy and Phenomenological Research came out, with groundbreaking works by Fender, Geiger, Scheller, and Reinach.
And that very same yearbook also included Husserl's ideas, which, if I'm not mistaken, introduced a major point of divergence within the movement.
That's right, a major turning point. In Ideas, Husserl really laid out his transcendental philosophy more clearly and forcefully, emphasizing this idea of an essential connection between reality and consciousness. He even said, and this is a famous quote, "An object existing in itself is never one with which consciousness or the ego pertaining to consciousness has nothing to do." That idea of an intrinsic link between the object and the experiencing subject became the bedrock of his transcendental idealism.
And I'm guessing this shift towards idealism wasn't a hit with everyone in Munich and Göttingen.
Let's just say they weren't exactly thrilled. While a few, like Herring and Ingarden, followed some of Husserl's leads and ideas, like the theory of essences or eidetics, the general reaction from the Munich and Göttingen circles was a doubling down on metaphysical realism. They couldn't accept Husserl's idealism. Their core belief was that reality exists independently of our minds, regardless of whether those minds are empirical or transcendental.
So this clash between realism and idealism became a huge dividing line in the phenomenological world.
Oh, absolutely. A fundamental disagreement that shaped the direction of phenomenological thought. Even Husserl's decision in 1928 to choose Heidegger, and not Fender, who was a staunch realist, as his successor at Freiburg shows just how profound this split was.
And then, of course, World War I broke out and had a devastating impact on these intellectual circles.
Absolutely tragic. The war pretty much shut down their collective work and shattered these tight-knit communities, especially the one in Göttingen. We lost so many promising phenomenologists. Reinach, Clemens, Frankfurter, Ritzel, they all died in the war. And then Husserl moved to Freiburg in 1916, which further dispersed the group.
But the phenomenological tradition, it didn't completely disappear, right?
No, it continued, but in a more scattered way. The main centers of activity became Munich and Bergzabern, where the Conrads had their estate and hosted regular discussions. Munich seemed poised to become the new center. Fender got a full professorship there, and Gallinger and von Hildebrand were also teaching there.
But as we know, the rise of the Nazis tragically ended this chapter.
It did. The Nazi regime's policies forced many of them to flee or face persecution. Von Hildebrand escaped to the U.S. Gallinger, being Jewish, had to seek refuge in Sweden. Geiger was forced to retire in Göttingen in 1933, and Schein, tragically, was murdered in Auschwitz in 1942. A truly terrible loss.
A sad ending to such a promising period. However, despite the tragic end, their ideas continued to live on, didn't they?
They did. Some members kept publishing after the war, and their ideas influenced later thinkers, people like Bassange, Hartmann, Kolnay, Ortega y Gasset, Spiegelberg, and even Karol Wojtyła, who later became Pope John Paul II.
Well, their history is definitely a testament to the complex relationship between intellectual pursuits and the larger forces of history. Now let's shift gears a bit and dig into some of their key philosophical contributions. Intentionality seems to be a recurring theme in their work. What were some of their major insights on this idea?
One of their most important, perhaps most unique contributions to this whole theory of intentionality is this idea that there are many, and I mean radically different kinds of intentionality. They're saying that our mental states can be directed towards objects and states of affairs in very different ways, and they thought that previous accounts, even maybe early interpretations of Husserl's logical investigations, kind of missed this complexity.
So they were pushing for a more nuanced understanding of how our minds relate to the world.
Exactly. And they did this by making two key distinctions. First, they differentiated between what they called meaning acts, meinen, and presentations, things like perception or imagination. The second distinction was between these cognitive acts and the various attitudes, Stellingnam, we take towards objects and facts, like believing, feeling, or willing.
Okay, let's start with meaning acts versus presentations. What's the core difference?
Early phenomenologists in these circles basically equated one sense of thinking with the act of meinen, meaning something. They argued that this was fundamentally different from presentations, which involve our direct, intuitive experiences, like perceiving a landscape or imagining a scene. They all focused on this distinction, even though they might have explained it in different ways.
Was Alexander Fender one of the first to really dig into this distinction?
Yes. In his early work, The Phenomenology of the Will, published in 1900, Fender initially described meaning as a kind of non-intuitive presentation, like a mental image that symbolically points to something else. So thinking of a person might involve a mental image that stands for that person.
But I'm sensing that his view on this evolved, right?
Right. It did, significantly. By 1898, in one of his lectures, he realized that presentations always involve intuition, while meaning acts don't. He used this great example of understanding a lecturer. When we understand what the lecturer is saying, our meaning is directed at what they're referring to. But this is totally different from our perception of their actual words. We perceive the words directly, but the things the words are about, they might not be directly present.
So the way we engage with words is completely different from how we engage with their meaning.
Exactly. And Fender kept emphasizing this difference, eventually arguing that meaning acts are their own distinct category, not just a special type of presentation. He even thought the idea of a non-intuitive presentation was a contradiction. For him, meaning acts referred to objects mainly through language or symbols, which is why he linked them with thinking.
And Reinach, in his work on negative judgments, he took this further. Right?
He did. Reinach also saw Meinen as a broader form of thinking, contrasting it with the kind of thinking that focuses on abstract objects. He also had a broader definition of presentation, including all mental acts that give us some sort of intuitive access to objects. This includes sensory perception, imagination, and what he called presentifications, which are acts that make an object present without actually perceiving it.
So Reinach was making specific distinctions to separate meaning acts from presentations.
Yes, he argued that meaning acts are inherently linguistic, while presentations aren't. And crucially, he said that meaning acts are blind, meaning that just meaning something doesn't make us experience any of its features directly. He also pointed out that meaning acts are temporally punctual, they don't last in time like a perceptual experience might. You wouldn't ask how long it took you to mean something, but you could ask how long you were looking at something.
Makes sense. We can look at a tree for a while, but the act of meaning a tree seems instantaneous.
Exactly. Reinach also tackled Husserl's idea of fulfillment, the idea that a thought without content can be filled by perception. Reinach agreed that presentations can be fulfilled, but he insisted that the thing being fulfilled isn't a meaning act. Even though the objects of meaning and presentations can overlap, the acts themselves are different. Meaning acts don't have the intuitive content needed for fulfillment.
So two different types of mental acts with distinct ways of connecting to their objects.
Exactly. And to further emphasize this, Theodor R. Conrad even reserved the term intentionalität for meaning acts. He used consciousness of for presentations. Wilhelm Ritzel took this further, proposing that these acts differ because they connect to different kinds of objects. Presentations, he argued, point to concrete objects, while meaning acts use language to point to concepts, and it's through concepts that they ultimately refer to objects.
Didn't Ritzel also have an interesting take on empirical concepts?
He did. He suggested that empirical concepts, those based on our senses, work like proper names, directly referring to their objects, much like John Stuart Mill's theory of names. For Ritzel, the content of these concepts is basically what they refer to. This idea actually foreshadowed later theories about direct reference and rigid designation.
It sounds like this idea that intentionality is a feature of meaning acts and not all experiences was pretty popular in those circles.
It was. A lot of thinkers agreed with that. Deber, Geiger, Stavenhagen, Brunswig. But not everyone was on board. For instance, Karolitsky, while he agreed with the distinction, he didn't think meaning was completely blind. He thought meaning could bring us closer to the essence of the object. Then others, like Schopp, Hoffmann, Leyendecker, Heinrich, they were closer to Husserl's later view that thinking and perception can actually blend together, with concepts shaping our perception. Schopp, for example, argued that the stuff we experience and the concepts we use to understand it, they're only separable in our minds, not in our lived experience. Hoffmann focused on Husserl's idea of apprehension, that process of understanding what we perceive through concepts. Leyendecker, on the other hand, looked at how our cognition actually influences our perception.
So even within these circles, there were disagreements and variations on this core concept of intentionality. Now let's talk about the second distinction, the one between cognitive acts and the different attitudes we can take towards things.
This is all about the difference between just passively receiving information and actively reacting to it. They called the passive part cognitions and the active part attitudes, Stellanum. So you perceive a child falling, that's the cognition, but then you form the belief that the child is falling, and that's a doxastic attitude, specifically a belief. They also argued that attitudes are the kinds of things you can ask why about. You can ask why you believe something, why you feel a certain way, why you want to do something. You don't usually ask why about a simple perception.
Let's break down these attitudes a bit. You mentioned doxastic attitudes like belief. What are they like?
Well, think of it this way. You see a child falling, that's the initial cognition. But then you form the belief, oh, that child is falling, and that's the doxastic attitude of belief. They also said that beliefs last for a while, they can be positive or negative, and we hold them with different levels of certainty. They contrasted belief with apprehension, which is more immediate. It's that moment of realizing something. Apprehension, they said, isn't positive or negative and doesn't have degrees of certainty. Interestingly, they thought that both beliefs and apprehensions are based on cognitions, and that apprehension can actually justify beliefs, but not the other way around. It's like saying knowing something is more basic than believing it.
Interesting. What about affective attitudes? The ones related to feelings and emotions.
Right. Let's go back to the child falling. You perceive it, but you also immediately grasp that it's bad, that there's danger involved. This awareness of value, they argued, is a special kind of act they called feeling, fühlen. It's a direct, non-conceptual way of experiencing values like dangerousness, beauty, or injustice. This feeling of value is different from having an emotion about it. You can recognize something is dangerous without feeling scared. Max Scheler, who was a big part of these circles, created a whole system categorizing different kinds of feelings and emotions, linking them to a hierarchy of values. Other phenomenologists also did a lot of work on sentiments, moods, and even self-conscious feelings.
So there's a difference between recognizing a value and actually having an emotional response to it. And then there are conative attitudes, the ones about our will and intentions.
Exactly. Cognitive attitudes are how we actively react to what we know and the values we see. Like, you decide you want to help the falling child. That's a combative attitude. The phenomenologists thought the will was central to our actions, and they argued that willing is its own thing, different from just wanting something. They believed that when we will something, we're ready to make a decision or form an intention, Entschluss or Vorsatz, to go for it. Intentions, they said, are mental actions we take to achieve a goal. They are self-determined, we commit to them, and they can actually kickstart our actions, though there was some debate about whether there's always an intermediary act of will involved. They also said that intentions guide our actions through what they called acts of realization.
So they're describing a whole system from passively taking in information to actively engaging with it through our will and intentions. Fascinating. Now, you also mentioned that they explored social, empathic, and collective experiences. How did that fit in?
Right. They went beyond just individual intentionality and looked at what they called intersubjective intentionality, basically, how our minds interact and relate to the minds of others. They did a lot of work on social acts, empathy, and collective experiences.
Okay, let's start with social acts. Things like making a promise or giving an order. What was their take on those?
They define social acts as actions that need to be understood by another person to really work. This includes promises, orders, questions, you name it. Unlike some later theories that focused on the rules and conventions of these acts, they saw them as mental actions with a social dimension. Fender and Daubert started exploring this area. Fender looked at the logic of commands, and Daubert focused on questions.
And then Reinach came along with a more developed theory.
He did. In 1913, Reinach presented his theory of social acts. He famously defined them as in need of being heard, Vernehmungsbedürftig. He said that for a social act to work, 3 things need to happen. First, the other person has to see or hear you doing it. Second, they need to understand what you're saying. And third, they need to get what kind of act it is, like if it's a promise or just a statement. He also analyzed the illocutionary effects of these acts, meaning the consequences of doing them, like how a promise creates an obligation. He also looked at how social acts can be changed or modified. His work is still really influential today when people talk about speech acts.
That makes a lot of sense, that these acts are meant to be understood. What about empathy? How do they explain our ability to understand other people's mental states?
Earlier on, Theodor Lipps had a theory of empathy based on the idea of imitation. He thought we have an innate drive to imitate others, leading us to project our own feelings onto them. But the Munich and Göttingen folks weren't convinced. They questioned whether this actually explained understanding and whether it requires actually feeling what the other person feels. They offered an alternative, led by thinkers like Scheler and Schwenninger. They believed that mental states aren't completely hidden. We can often see them in people's expressions, gestures, and behavior. Schwenninger, in his 1908 work, argued that there's a direct link between the expression and what's being expressed. He thought we can perceive another's mental state directly without having to recreate it in our own minds. Stein took this even further, saying, understanding involves perceiving the mental state, then putting yourself in their shoes to really grasp what they're experiencing, and finally achieving knowledge about their mental state.
So it's a more direct kind of understanding, not just projecting our own feelings onto someone else.
Exactly. And they also looked at collective experiences, what they called the we relation, going beyond the individual I-thou connection of empathy and social acts.
How did they see that we relation as different?
Their work on shared experiences was tied to their study of social groups. They used ideas from Tenney's and differentiated between societies, communities, and masses. Scheler also added his analysis of the characteristics of the mass. They described masses and crowds as driven by this mental contagion, where mental states are spread unconsciously and irrationally. Societies, on the other hand, involve more reasoned interactions. Communities, though, they're special. They're about truly shared experiences that create a sense of togetherness and solidarity, that feeling of us. There was some debate on what makes these collective experiences possible, with Walther, Stein, and Stavenhagen each offering different ideas. They looked at the roles of shared knowledge, empathy, common goals, and even the individual's understanding of their place in the group.
So they really tried to understand all the ways we connect with each other, from individual interactions to shared group experiences. Now, lastly, you mentioned their theory of objects, or ontology. What were their key thoughts there?
These phenomenologists weren't content with just describing experiences. They also wanted to understand the objects in those experiences and the nature of reality itself. Their ontology had three main characteristics. First, they were metaphysical realists. They believed that the world mostly consists of objects that exist whether we think about them or not. They knew that some things, like artifacts or social constructs, depend on our minds, but their basic assumption was that reality has a being of its own, independent of consciousness. Second, they were ontological pluralists. They believed that objects belong to fundamentally different categories, and we need different tools to understand them. This was a big reason why they rejected psychologism, which they thought flattened these distinctions. They also emphasized describing objects as they appear without trying to reduce them to something else. Finally, they were essentialists. They thought that objects are defined by their essences. Basin. They used this in two ways. The essence that makes a specific individual unique, its so being, and the essence that defines the kind it belongs to, its what being. They argued that these essences, especially the what being kind, explain why certain things are necessary, like why a promise creates an obligation. They generally believe that essences exist independently of any particular example as ideal and timeless entities, although Geiger also explored the idea of dynamic essences that change over time.
And within this framework, what were the basic categories of things they identified?
They basically said there are two fundamental kinds: objects and states of affairs. Objects are what we perceive or think about directly. They're the things singular terms refer to in language, whether they're concrete or abstract. Following Husserl, they divided objects into ideal objects, which are timeless and can be general, like properties, or individual, like Reinach's view of numbers, and real objects, which exist in time and are usually seen as either material or mental. However, their work on social ontology made things a bit more complicated. Promissory claims, for example, exist in time but aren't clearly material or mental, and their work in aesthetics suggested that there might be ideal essences that are still connected to time and history. States of affairs, Safferhalt, on the other hand, are what we think is true or false. They're the things that sentences refer to. The term comes from legal language, referring to the way things are. They also said that objects have an ontological structure made of states of affairs. For example, an object having certain values leads to what we might call states of value.
And was there any debate about the nature of these states of affairs?
There was. Reinach argued that all states of affairs have their own being, independent of our minds. He thought that every meaningful sentence refers to a state of affairs, and whether that sentence is true depends on whether that state of affairs actually exists. He saw states of affairs as the basis of truth, while sentences are just carriers of truth. Fender also talked about truth in terms of sufficient reason. Reinach also said that states of affairs are either positive or negative, and that for any state of affairs, either it or its opposite is true. He basically applied the idea of the excluded middle to reality itself. He thought logic is mostly about states of affairs and how they relate, and then about the truth or falsity of sentences. Dalbert, though, had a more complex view. He distinguished between states of affairs that exist independently of our minds, like the rose being red, and those that depend on how we think about them, which he called states of affairs as cognized, Kenntnis for Halt. He argued that the latter are just aspects of the former, selected and framed by our minds when we make judgments. He used the example of different phrases referring to the same underlying state of affairs to illustrate this. Husserl, later on, made a similar distinction between states of affairs and situations. Dauber also argued that states of affairs as they appear in questions or orders only exist because of those acts of questioning or ordering. He also didn't believe in the independent existence of negative states of affairs. He thought only negative Kenntnis for Halt exist. Similarly, while Fender initially thought that impersonal judgments refer to impersonal states of affairs, he later agreed with Daubert that this incompleteness is just in our understanding, not in the objects themselves.
So a really interesting debate about how our minds relate to the world, even at the level of basic reality. It's clear that the Munich and Göttingen circles explored a really wide range of philosophical questions.
They did. They covered major areas of philosophy, offering new and insightful perspectives on the nature of mind, language, action, knowledge, social interaction, values, and being itself.
It's amazing how much they accomplished, especially given the historical challenges they faced. But you mentioned earlier that their work isn't always given the attention it deserves in the history of philosophy. Why do you think that is?
It is a bit of a mystery. Despite their clear writing and the fact that many of their ideas were independently developed in other philosophical movements, they haven't always been front and center in the traditional narrative of 20th century philosophy.
But hopefully, with all the renewed interest in scholarship, their work will continue to gain recognition.
I agree. Rediscovering and engaging with their thought is going to enrich current philosophical discussions and give us a much richer understanding of how phenomenology developed.
This has been a really fascinating deep dive into a truly influential group of thinkers. When you think about the distinctions they made, like between simply being aware of something and actively meaning something by it, it makes you wonder how this could change our understanding of truth, communication, and even how we do philosophy itself. Thinking about these early phenomenologists and their work could offer us a new perspective on some of the oldest philosophical problems. We encourage you to explore more about these thinkers and the ideas we've talked about today. Thank you for joining us on the Deep Dive.
It's been a pleasure.